we had to bring all these three gentlemen back to the stage. As you already know, George is Managing Director at Insight, Abhishek is Managing Director at Prosperity 7, and Ramin is Venture Partner at DFJ. All of these three guys, they are exceptional investors. Their companies are doing really well. But let me start with, Abhishek to begin with. What is happening in the arena of intelligence? And what has kind of, pleasantly surprised you in the last year?
Yeah, I think the pace of change is just incredible. We all were thinking about, 1 year ago, we were talking about the reasoning agents and things around that. Now, agents are obvious, inference is obvious, silicon is obvious. 2 years ago, I was talking about that. But the pace of change and the rate of learning has just exploded. What we all thought would not be a possibility just 3 or 4 months ago, leave the revenue numbers aside from some of these leading model providers, is already here. But as we think about the next stages, some of which was covered by George as well, but interesting things which we never thought will be relevant are coming back to the focus area, which is data, of course, then things around memory. Memory, as I say, more around agent. The context layer is back with a bang. Everything else these days around is, relationships with different agents and the context layer. The eventual end result, or what people are looking for, is these agents to be more autonomous. They should be able to do more for more time independently, and that's the journey which we are on.
And do you think that, in the next couple of years, there's going to be even more acceleration of this trend? And if so, are there like specific parts? For example, CPUs made a big comeback this year. And that was a surprise. Last year, everybody was on GPUs. But this year, CPUs have made a big comeback. Do you think that there's like more surprises coming our way?
Yeah, exactly. I never sold Intel. Libu is a great friend of ours. But the idea around agents which operate in a different context than you interfacing with a frontier model, obviously, was very evident as more and more agents went into production and CPU usage went up. Now, as you're thinking about the efficiencies are becoming important. I was talking to one of the really big executives at a big company, and what he was saying was, I pay a lot of these frontier labs and a lot of these cloud to calculate zeros. The matrix multiplication on, you have a ginormous 1.3 trillion parameter model, but there's only few things or few specific weights which you need. Everything else is computed from one end into zeros, giving you the answer comes back, you compute zeros again, and you get the answer. There's a lot of inefficiency, obviously. Agents are going to help, but then what will also help is what part of the model should I be looking at? How many models should I be looking at? Should I be hitting the frontier models for all of these things? The idea around SLMs was great 6 months ago, but all that is transitioning as well. So the pace of change, I can't keep my head straight in terms of how fast things are moving.
Sure.
So George, in this changing world, how are you thinking about investing in the future? You talked so much about, the capabilities of the model going up. RL, for example, it was a big circle towards the end, the transition to that. But what else you think is going to change or get completely disrupted?
Yeah, it's not a straightforward moment for building or investing right now because of just how much is tectonically shifting as we speak. Certainly helps if you're in some of those companies that are benefiting from that shift. I think if we look at some of the infrastructure, Abhishek actually called out one area that I think is very fascinating right now, which is how do you use better long-range memory? And I think there's a likelihood that memory is not going to persist inside of the models per se. They're going to persist inside the enterprise, independent of where the models are. So I think that seems like a pretty compelling opportunity for sure. It does seem like the things that we would have thought the tool calling going into that layer of MCPs, which actually does work really well, is now being at least additive to where the skills and as I mentioned on stage earlier, the harness and the model converging are, that leaves a bit of like challenge for like someone who's like purely focused on infrastructure. And one of the things that I keep looking for is like, how does a founding team stay ahead of where the current frontier models are? And that in itself, I think, is a superpower, right? That you just kind of have a very strong sensibility of, okay, that domain that you're on, how do you stay ahead? And does that mean you deliver a fine-tuned model that you might have to throw away, when the frontier model generalizes to your area? And kind of living in that edge is something that I think I look for now as much as possible. The last is like, there are some areas that you just aren't going to see generalization. And one of the more interesting things is if you find these, big vertical opportunities that exist in spaces where the entire vertical can be reimagined, it's a big opportunity. Like the nursing example that I think I mentioned last year, an investment that I did in a company called Exicare. That was fascinating because we basically went from like a few million to, the first 15, 16 million in 12 months. And this year, the company's like on track to get to over 45 million. And the reason is like, it just reimagined the work that was accomplished that the nurses had to do when they were admitting patients into a specialty nursing care facility. And the model that they produced, the fine-tuned model that they produced, was at least initially 70% accurate in comparison to a nurse being 60% accurate. The next generation of that model was 94% accurate. That pretty much blew the barn doors open for that market because nurses wanted to get back to nursing and not processing admissions documents. So I think when you look at those opportunities, there's a lot more of those. Like if there's 1,000, if not 10,000 flowers like that to bloom. So from an investment standpoint, that's also an area where, I get excited that if the founder can stay ahead, teams can stay ahead, and they know where the frontier models are going to generalize and be willing to run fast enough at these domain-specific examples where there's large market opportunities. I mean, exactly what, Ashwin's demo, oh my God, that was killer, right? Same exact idea that like there's a domain that we can own here that we'll just stay ahead of where the models are. I think that's where I get really excited for a net new investment.
Yep. Now, Ramin, you were also an operator before you became an investor. Last week, Dave, you and I were chatting about what is potentially going to hold the enterprises back. And then we talked about, the lack of the infrastructure. But you were also part of VMware, which was a significant transition from CPUs which were idle to containers that were, or virtual machines that started running way more efficiently. There have been a few transitions of that kind in the industry. This is a unique moment where, intelligence has to be operationalized. And, it did not occur to me until, I would say, a few months ago, that this is going to be like the biggest effort in sort of diffusing this extremely powerful technology in the world. Given your experience, what do you think is going to hold the enterprise back and what can they do?
It's interesting because picking up on the thread of how quickly the moats that companies are building are being kind of disintegrated and disrupted. It's important for us to step back for a second. We're in this microcosm of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and every week, every month, there's innovations from you name it vendor. But what's most important to realize here is that organizations need to fundamentally change before enterprises can get the value out of AI investments. In fact, last year it's estimated that there was $644 billion invested by the enterprise in AI, of which only quarter, 22%, is actually measurable metrics that are delivering ROI. So where's all that money going? Where's that investment going? Well, there's a lot of people, like probably us, that have multiple tools, agents running on your desktop, chewing up tokens for different tasks. But that's really level one, stage one adoption of AI, right? That's a chatbot. That's a personal productivity tool. That's where a lot of organizations, when you measure CIOs, CFOs, CEOs, Are you using AI because the board's up there behind? Oh yeah, we got Microsoft Copilot, right? That's foundational. But level 2 is where you start to see an agent improve more than an individual's task. It's a department task, and it can run for several hours, like George was talking about. It cannot run for days. But yet, here we sit, we talk about multi-agent orchestration and doing things across organizations. That doesn't exist hardly anywhere. And you ask yourself, why? Well, 88% said they're investing in AI. Only 1% are getting actually value measured and returned in ROIs, according to Deloitte, right? So you unpack that a little bit more, and you realize that there's context that's missing. There's external context, there's internal context, the human, and then there's organizational context that AI can't learn. For example, when you make a decision on whether you're going to renew a contract because of certain metrics, you're going to give up margin, you're going to discount more. It takes several people to get together to make that decision. That's a business decision that ultimately has to roll up to you or Sam or whoever else because you don't want to lose that customer. You're giving up points because you're going to make it up somewhere else. That cross-organizational decision requires a meeting. That's not what AI can do yet. It can do everything from a service request and a ticket for escalation to engineering to marketing to whatever else. My point is, we're in this gap where people can't make that chasm jump from level 2 to level 3 where it's multi-agentic, cross-organizational, because there's context missing. And that's where reinforcement learning comes in. That's where organizational learning comes in. And at the end of the day, we're all humans. And as much as we all like technology here in the Valley, and maybe forward-leaning tech companies, there's a lot that fear it. There's a lot that are going to resist it. And that's where adoption slows. And it's important for us to also remember that adoption does not equal maturity, right? Just because we're all adopting chatbots or AI Claude on our desktops, and I was yelling and cursing at it this weekend because I couldn't get Twilio to work for an agent to call and send a message to me, and my son's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm trying to register our kid because he's got to go over this thing, right?" So I'm like, I'm not going to keep checking this website. I'm going to have Cowork write an agent, and the agent's going to call Twilio and it's going to notify me, and I can log in. Well, that didn't work because the website didn't work. So the point is, systems of record are the limitations here. Humans and organizational resistance are the barriers here, and that's going to take several years. Now, another survey has indicated that 74% of CIOs surveyed said that they're going to invest in multi-agentic systems and be able to take advantage of that in the next 2 years. 2 years, right? So we all think it's happening today here because everything we read. But the reality is, there's a lot of companies outside the Valley, outside of US, outside of where else, that we have to be cognizant of how long it takes for adoption there to happen and organizational change to happen.
But I'm convinced that autonomy is a journey. It's not an event that happened yesterday or today with the launch of the X-Lake platform. As much as, George said, oh my God, Ashwin's demo was so amazing. We know that the demo was amazing, but it will take some time for that whole technology to be diffused.
Technology has never been the barrier. The human has, and the human resistance.
One of the more interesting examples when you mentioned the autonomy, will take a few years to diffuse. I mean, just look at how long it really, really took to get an autonomous vehicle working.
Yeah.
Like we're just at that point where a Waymo works as we would expect it to work. And that was...
Except for last weekend in the cul-de-sac going around.
Yeah, and then there's all those crazy stories you hear that come up. But that's a good 12 years, more than a decade, right, to get to even just a little past level 4 autonomy. So this will take some time, for sure.
So on that thought, you asked, what is it going to take? Everyone's at level 1 to level 2 today in terms of that adoption. And a lot of people are talking about AGI and superintelligence, right? And you read blogs, you read things about there, we don't even know how to frickin' measure that, right? We can't even measure the return on multi-agentic systems. And you ask yourself, why? You know what? It goes back to picks and shovels. The companies that are going to be providing the technology, like Acceldata does, to help customers get over that trough of disillusionment or the crossing the chasm that Jeffrey Moore put it years ago, that can help bring governance, that can help bring security, that can help bring compliance, that can help bring visibility and control, right? A catalog, a deployment environment. That's what's going to help accelerate from stage 2 to stage 3. And then organizations can adopt it faster.
So there is this, massive comeback of open source at the moment, because the best projects, the most adopted projects, they are getting built in the open source community. Whether you look at, LangGraph, you look at any of these popular frameworks or technologies regarding AI, I think everything is coming back into the open source. CNCF is extremely popular again, but there's also like a little bit of an illusion of being able to build. So, I was having a conversation that, look, here's the X-Lake platform, and the response that I got from a couple of, really smart people was that, oh, maybe I can actually put a few developers or forward deployed engineers and build it myself. But that's not always real. And, George, let me take this back to you. You've been investing in, thematically you invested in the data pipeline technologies, and now you're again looking at sort of, the disruption of the software ecosystem and the chain. There's like a lot of risk in just taking pure open source and putting it in production. Who knows what flew in?
Yeah, I think the thing that is very clear about going down the choose your own journey around particularly owning your own open source infrastructure is, yes, you have to have the resources, the capacity, the capability to do it yourself, and some organizations do. Most organizations generally don't. But I think there's actually another nuance that I think people forget, which is when you're taking an open source underpinning and pulling it together into something coherent that works in the enterprise, taste actually matters. And
indeed,
people forget that, right? That like good software engineering still comes from the taste of the 10x engineer and the capable PM that are collaborating together to build something, profound. And I don't think that just cobbling open source together, I used to hear this all the time. One of my favorite stories ever when I was president of Alteryx back in the day was I walked into Goldman Sachs, and the head of all of engineering at Goldman Sachs, he had a 2,000 person organization, and we weren't open source, but nevertheless, he kind of came in and he just like had this pouty look on his face, and he was like, I can just go build this. Alteryx, that is. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right, you could, but why would you, right? And this is Goldman Sachs. Of all the places that could build it, certainly he could have. And he thought about that for a second, and I think the conversation immediately went to like, look, we made a lot of opinionated choices, right? And how we built Alteryx in those days. I think Acceldata is like, we've made a lot of opinionated choices on where we're taking our platform as it's evolved, particularly in these last 3-4 years. I don't think you can just cobble up open source anymore. And any successful company that has been built on open source has made some tremendous opinionated choices on what they built on top and what they built around and they built over and what they've reformatted and what they've optimized. I mean, gosh, just look at what Ollie did with Databricks, right? I mean, Spark does not equal Databricks by any stretch of the imagination at this point. So I do not recommend that. It is a quixotic journey at best if someone believes they can build it themselves.
If I can add to that, I think I completely agree. But what has also happened in the market is, which was never the case before, is you can attempt to think about building a CRM system. A lot of people have built CRM system. I built one. Or some of these things where the institutional software knowledge was so high and the amount of effort for software engineering was so high, that advantage has gone away. You can take an open source model and tinker your way through and somewhat get to a reasonable outcome. Where it starts becoming challenging is in an enterprise setting when you are clobbering up a lot of these open sources and getting data from one of these places, getting to the other places, because at the end of the day, what matters is whose throat am I going to choke? Well, if something goes wrong, is this the open source model from Quen that went down? Or it was, Databricks, some connectivity there, or somebody's MCP wasn't written properly, or somebody got hacked? That is going to be the challenge. However, the intensity of software building has dramatically reduced. What does that mean? That means the margin pressures are going to be on custom-built software stacks that you're already seeing in the markets. The markets are repricing a lot of these custom-built software stacks. Per seat pricing has gone away, usability is there, and that is the future which you're rolling in. The future which we're rolling into is, I don't care what your platform does. And I remember you and I had this conversation 2 years ago. And now you see this is happening, which is, I don't want to learn your platform. I don't care about your platform. Here's my job. Here's the answer I'm looking for. How do you get there? The fastest answer, the cheapest answer, and the best way to get it done wins. How much open source did I use? How many people and bodies did I replace? Doesn't matter, which is why you still see. Last thing which I'll say is, this is counterintuitive. And then I was just reading about this, is what people thought was the open source models are about 6 months behind the latest and greatest from frontier labs. Guess what? After RL and after some of these specific innovations which these guys have done on inference side, is that gap is now starting to widen. So this is counterintuitive. Now that gap in the 5.5 and Anthropic is gone to about 8 to 12 months. So you're never going to replace that with open source. That journey is going to be different, but the outcome which you're looking from clobbering up your own stack is going to be different. It is that experiment was a horror story for most of us when it was in DevOps land, or when people were setting up the Kubernetes stack by themselves before Kubernetes. You all remember Mesosphere. Try imagining that time. That part or that horror has been taken away. But that doesn't mean you are production grade. That's the difference.
And Ramin, you also invested in a couple of security companies, which is actually managing the supply chain in which software is getting pushed in and then coming out on the other side. What is the impact on security? I think that is like one of the biggest areas where open source has a big problem. The CVEs, the vulnerabilities that just flow in.
I think George's slide showed it. There's probably too many security companies, arguably. And you wonder why. Well, it's kind of like the old thing, you can't get fired if you buy enough tools, or you can't get fired if you purchase IBM. So a lot of CISOs play defense. And that just can't work anymore. And so a lot of technology innovation investing is going towards offensive technologies and companies that can help not just engineering, not just security teams, but also core engineering teams as those functions and responsibilities change. If we all remember, hell, I was pitching this crap years ago, the full DevSecOps lifecycle and integration with all these tools. Well, shift left and all that. Not many companies were really doing that because organizational boundaries, let alone technology limitations. Well, now the full stack engineer has to be a full context engineer. They're expected to do this and this, right? And so they have to have a security first principles built in. So what you're going to see is penetration testing, as an example, that used to be ad hoc, once a year, twice a year, you had some budget, you paid someone. That has to shift left and be part of a critical SDLC process, the AI SDLC. Mm-hmm. So I led investment in a company called Expo that's essentially doing that, where they have a swarm of agents that act on behalf of you as users, and they just try to find vulnerabilities. That with what you see in, obviously, with what Anthropic has released in terms of their own model, and everyone's freaking out about it like George talked about, is actually creating more noise. It's creating more discomfort because it's finding vulnerabilities that are probably not high severity that you would ever want to fix. But then a user is confused. Like, do I fix this or do I fix that? So it goes back to this middleware layer that has to sit on top of these agentic systems and LLMs and other tools below that has to start to reason and give you insights into security, compliance, governance, usability. Guess what? what we do here, right? In terms of what Acceldata provides our customers, observability. And so these picks and shovels type of capabilities are going to be critical to help those customers get that leap to stage 3. But more importantly, you're going to see a huge disruption in the cybersecurity change. Because how did we used to sell before? I used to go pimp a VAR or a distributor to that, give them points to go have dinner and coffee with a CISO so that they can go sell to the CISO. Remember this, George? How many dinners do we go to try to do that? And now, that decision now is with engineering team. Because they're going to buy a tool that does security right next to when they're deploying with the new IDE and working through a cloud interface, and they don't have a clue what the hell security is doing upstream or downstream for them. So it's going to change the whole organizational responsibility. It's going to change the tool landscape. And not only in cybersecurity, but you're going to see a lot less tools. I call it the liposuction of the SDLC, right? There's so many companies that play in the SDLC lifecycle, they're gone. And similarly with security.
It's funny you mentioned the security thing because if we think about where the last generation of system observability folks went, right, they all ended up building SIMs, right? And they all built kind of first-gen security products. Oh yeah, you would know of all, right? It's an interesting, I'm not setting any roadmaps for Acceldata for the future, but like it's a really compelling idea, right? But we could actually take a lot of our data observability substrate and the agents that we're talking about on it and build a very compelling security product that is actually, grounded in some of the best data pipelines in the world.
So the only comment on that, George, was that the demo slot given to Ashwin was only 12 minutes.
Yeah, right. But Ashwin's like really pissed off at me right now for saying this, right? But no, it is going to be a natural evolution of like any observability company as they're getting into the enterprise to inherently provide a great security experience. And you saw that, right? And any last generation of system observability provider saw it. I think this is going to be in our cards not in the not too distant future for sure.
100%. So the way that we imagined, for example, the X-Lake architecture, obviously there's like a flattening of the capability because of a huge architectural shift. The capabilities of elasticity and separation of storage and compute, that was only available on the cloud. But now it's available anywhere, if you choose to deploy it. One of the contra trends that at least I have seen when talking to CIOs and everyone else is the amount of investments that they're making on their data center efforts.
Yeah.
Because the OpEx on the cloud is continuously going up. And the ROI, surprise, surprise, is less than 2.5 years on bringing up a new data center or infrastructure. And when you think about it, the access to the intelligence, the human activity and the agentic activity, along with the governance layer, which we just introduced at the top, we could become, a security provider as well, because the entire posture of data lakes, data warehouses, and SaaS can be exposed through the whole platform.
I think the challenge with that, though, is like selling to security audiences and buyers today still has not transitioned to the engineering team from a budget and tooling perspective.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? And not many CIOs, let alone CISOs, are going to allow that shift in budget dollars or tool decision.
I agree, but that's like a board level discussion that we'll have in a week's time, which is when we sign off on the roadmap, but I completely agree with you on the point.
The interesting thing you say that is historically been true, but then you look at certain aspects like pen testing that you just mentioned, or last year I had invested in Promptfood, which is my first security investment in the open source agentic red teaming space. And of course, OpenAI just bought them a few months ago.
Yeah.
And so when those areas of security shift over to the engineer and the developer, I think there is
100% agree.
There is a pretty interesting opportunity at those moments.
But there's separation of church and state.
Yeah, there's a lot of gravity that's still.
And the thing to remember here is like, there's one thing about governance and there's another thing about control.
Yep.
Right? And so CIOs, CISOs, CTOs, CEOs, all of us that do this now, right? Or used to, they want assurance. So they want visibility to what's happening and who's accessing what type of systems and tools. And I think for Acceldata, That's a logical extension for us in terms of security and giving that assurance and moving upstack to governance. Because now, guess what's happening? As the SaaS vendors get commoditized, there's going to be a whole new data tax that's going to be charging everyone. SAP just did this. They're shutting down access, right? You're going to pay for the data. Salesforce did it. And other ISVs are going to do it because their users are not going to the UI. Agents are accessing that data. And as that happens more and more, what are they going to defend? Well, the data. And so then you ask yourself, well, as the data leaks and goes to a central data lake, right? And now it's accessible by all these other systems, holy shit, we have a bigger problem on our hands. And so this is where I think reliability or governance and more importantly assurance is really important for what Acceldata is doing as part of an extension of our observability stack to provide that to CIOs and CISOs.
That's right. It's interesting when on one of George's slide, the inference or the cost of inferencing is going down. If we were to superimpose, the opinions of many of the CIOs here and, who we've spoken with, the cost of data is just continuously going up. And it's not surprising to us because the world is producing 30% more data year over year. As more applications come online, which are built through vibe coding, they're going to produce more data. All of that data has to eventually flow into the data lakes, which is then getting optimized for analytics, AI, and further operational usage. That whole data lake is going to bloat up like anything.
100%, and you'll get this. Yeah. Acceldata has the opportunity to be the AI data broker, right? There's no one else doing this at this size, this scale, this flexibility across different environments, legacy Hadoop to modern LLMs, right? And so we have a unique opportunity, and I know you were pitching this, and so was I, about this data broker years ago, right? But in all earnest, the industry wasn't ready, technology wasn't there, and it required a massive amount of ETL and consulting and process change to move data from Informatica to Databricks or to Snowflake. Why? Why do we have to do that? You shouldn't have to do that. And now Acceldata provides the choice, provides the flexibility, and provides the security and governance to allow the data to sit where it is, but all the other residual services and processes to sit on top of. That's a unique position to be in.
Yeah, I mean, every single time that I've met a data leader, they're in the midst of migration, either taking off or landing it back down. And there are customers who are here who've actually taken all their data onto the cloud, and now they're spending another 2 years to bring all of that data back because it's not working anymore. So we've seen the whole cycle. Let's take a few questions. Great. Yeah.
Mike. Yeah, just grab a mic for.
Hi, I'm Nikita. I think what I'm trying to understand is as we're moving towards outcome-based, solutions, most often today sort of ends up happening that you have to layer services on top of the product. Is that something you guys see? Is that scalable? What are your thoughts? Just wanted to pick your brain.
I'm happy to do that. That has been a thesis for us, which we've been pursuing for now about 12 months. We used to call it service as a software, but now it is evident everywhere. You see the kind of companies which, you start with your product, and back to what I was saying, nobody cares about your product. People want to get the outcome. The outcome will need services. The business model change about 6 or 8 months ago, which was obvious, was you're no longer hitting tools budgets. You're now starting to hit people budgets across the entire stack. And if you start hitting the people budget, there are things which you can do. So all the early stage, hey, writing the ticket, looking at this, talking to the customer service, blah, 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 all those things are automated. But then the high value ticket items are getting there as well. So the business models have changed. Look at the biggest companies or software companies on the planet, they have moved towards that, whether it was Adobe, whether it was Salesforce, so on and so forth. There is an opportunity for huge companies to be created here. Private equity to be completely reimagined. Look at the headlines in the last 4 months. Almost everybody and their mother in the private equity world has teamed up with one frontier lab and have decided to become the services company. So when I was growing up in venture capital career, services used to be a 4-letter word. You went for enterprise, You went for enterprise sales, you sold platform. Guess what? It has 180-degree turn, at least as far as I see in my investing these days, which is what matters is revenue. Where do you get the revenue? It doesn't matter. Get the revenue which is going to stick around for us. Without naming the company, I'll give you one of my portfolio companies, which in its first life was 0 to about 20 million in revenue for first 5 years, sorry. And then they fired their entire enterprise sales force, completely moved towards service, still selling the same thing, but selling it to the people budgets. In 6 months, they're closer to 200 million. 6 months. Look at some of the other. So I'm dialing up the contrast for a reason, but this is happening. More and more of this is coming all our ways.
Yep. All right. George, Abhishek, Ramin, pleasure having you again, and thank you so much for doing this. Look forward to doing this again next year.